So I guess we are on.
Yep.
Welcome to Star Trek. How does it thrive? And I don't want to hear anything about fertilizer. We are obviously here to talk about the franchise in its entirety, going all the way back to that first pilot back in 65, the run of 66 to 69, Next Gen, DS9, Voyager, Enterprise, and all of the new shows, Discovery, Picard, Lower Decks, the upcoming Prodigy, the books. It thrives in multiple media. It thrives in multiple formats. How? Keith.
And go.
Wrong! Derek, go.
Back to Keith.
Jack Jamone. Wrong!
Spock's ears are really cool.
All right. Well, that's it. We're solved.
That's it. Okay, we can go home.
Yeah, we're good.
We're good.
For the next 53 minutes, you may entertain yourselves.
It's going to be that kind of deal.
Would you expect any less? We should probably tell these people who they are, who we are.
Look who they put on the panel. Let's
That's true.
Keith, tell them who you are.
I'm this guy.
He's that dude. He's a Muppet washed on high.
Thank you. Yes.
It never ends.
It never ends. The roast never ends. 12 years it'll be.
Yep.
In July. Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm Keith R. Candido. I have written a lot of Star Trek fiction, bunch of novels, bunch of short stories, bunch of novellas, bunch of comic books. For the last, God help me, 10 years, I have been writing about Star Trek also for the pop culture website Tor.com, doing rewatches of the classic series, as well as reviews of the new shows as they come out. I'm currently in the midst of a Voyager rewatch. I'm partway through season 5. In fact, when I'm done here, I have to go back to working on the one for Latent Image. And I've completed rewatches of the original series, DS9, TNG, and now working on Voyager, and I'll be tackling Enterprise after that. Plus, I've also been watching Star Trek pretty much since birth.
Derek, tell them who you are.
So my name is Derek Tyler Attico. I, as Keith, have been watching Star Trek since pretty much birth. I'm a two-time winner of the Star Trek Strange New Worlds anthology. I'm currently working. Thank you. I'm currently working with Modiphius Games on Star Trek Adventures, which is phenomenal. And I love this stuff. I love every iteration, every form, every fashion of Star Trek.
And I am your moderator, David Mack. Like these two gentlemen, I also grew up watching Star Trek pretty much from the very beginning. I was born right after the third season of the original series ended, but I grew up watching it in syndicated reruns, and now I am a New York Times bestselling author of many Star Trek novels, among many others. I have written 29 Star Trek novels that have been published so far. I believe I'm working on, it's either 28 published and I'm working on 29, or I've had 29 and now I'm working on 30. It's one or the other.
It would be really cool if the one you're working on is number 30.
Wouldn't it be cool? Wouldn't it? With my luck, it's 29. In any event. But I've also written for Star Trek on television, from Deep Space Nine, sold a story to Voyager that ended up not being made. I've written for Star Trek games. I've written Star Trek comic books. I've written Star Trek reference materials, such as the Omnipedia CD-ROM. I also, like Keith, have done some Trek rewatch stuff for Tor.com. I did the first, with Dayton Ward, I did part of the original TOS rewatch, where we picked up the third season from a couple of other writers. So I've been all over Trek. My fingerprints are all over Trek. I'm currently a consultant working on the new Star Trek animated series, Star Trek Prodigy, coming later this year. I was a consultant on season 1 of Lower Decks and a non-official consultant on the first season of Star Trek Discovery. So that's who we are, and those are our bona fides. So we're here to talk Trek. So let's start with the enduring appeal of the series. I think at this point, a lot of people know the appeal of it, but for those who maybe are watching this because they're like, why should I be interested in Star Trek? Let's tell them why. Keith, why do you think?
I think ultimately the thing, and part of it is because it's been a consistent part of Star Trek, is that it always, even when it goes dark, Star Trek always presents ultimately a hopeful future.
Right.
It is a future in which the Earth is united, in which we have moved past a lot of the stupid prejudices that we have now, and it's not perfect. And in fact, a lot of times that utopia that they present is challenged, whether it's the Dominion War in Deep Space Nine, or the Klingon War in the first season of Discovery, or the Synth Ban in Picard, whatever. But it always comes back to that hopeful future, and that emphasis of compassion over violence. That it's the solution in a Star Trek episode is almost always being nice to other people, not being better at shooting things than or winning the space battle.
It's the Will Wheaton "don't be a dick" philosophy.
Yeah, pretty much. One of the things I love about the end of the Dominion War is that what really ended the war was Odo basically saying, "I will give you the cure if you stop for your disease if you stop fighting."
Right.
It wasn't one side's military might over the other. It was an act of compassion that ended the war. And Star Trek has always come back to that. It's always been, and that's always a good message to see, whether it's 1966 or especially in 2020. It gives people hope.
So
above and beyond what Keith has already said, Derek, do you have any thoughts beyond that?
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Matt. Yes.
Floor is yours, sir.
I think beyond it being that, it's also it stays relevant, and it's been a mirror for a lot of topics in different decades. And some of those topics, of course, stay the same, but as they change, I think Star Trek has changed with it. I think its storytelling, its characters, the lens that we see these characters through has changed, and I think that's really relevant to keeping Star Trek unique and to having it thrive in society. Because if it's something that is still telling that same story from '65, I think it would have honestly died out by now. But by staying relevant, by being a mirror to society, it's saying, hey, Star Trek has that optimistic future, and we're also paying attention to events and issues that we're dealing with today in the 21st century, but we're putting a 23rd, 24th, 25th century, 32nd century spin on it.
I think one of the things I've always enjoyed about Trek is the fact that it tries to not only hold up a mirror to the society that we live in and who we are now, it aspires to show us who we could be if we were willing to try a little harder. And what I also like is that it shows a future in which whoever in that time of period when the show is being made is perceived as the enemy or the other or the outsider, they show them as accepted member of the crew. In the 60s, the outsiders were people like the Chinese or the Russians. So they had Sulu. Of course, that's not a Chinese name, but they tried. But then they had Chekhov. They wanted to show that even in the thick of the Cold War, just a few years after the Cuban Missile Crisis, there would be a future where people of the West and people of Russia would serve together as friends and comrades, and that this would not be seen in any way as strange. And then when we got to later series, we began to see that they started incorporating, like for instance, with Discovery and now with Picard, we're seeing the incorporation of openly gay characters, non-binary people of non-binary gender identity, people who are sort of still struggling to find equal footing in society, still, trying to secure their rights. And Star Trek is saying, this is who we're talking about. These are real people. They can be your friends. They can be your family members, your trusted comrades. They're not so scary.
Right.
They're just people.
Right.
Get to know them.
Right. They're not the other. They're actually us.
They're us.
And
They're all
them.
us.
Right. They're all
them.
Right.
And they also do it through non-human characters as well. I mean, Spock and Odo and the EMH and Data all have been that sort of, outsider character who is not human but can, and Saru for that matter.
Yes.
Characters who can comment on humanity even though they're not actually human by showing different aspects.
Exactly.
And it enables them to, get more down deep into the metaphor and being able to cover themselves by saying, well, they're aliens, so it's but it works. And showing that struggle, especially the struggles that somebody like Data or Odo, who is unique, or the EMH, who are pretty much the only ones of their kind, or someone like Spock who's stuck between two different societies, and how they struggle for acceptance and such, which is something that's very compelling to somebody. One of the great appeals of Spock for a lot of people in the 60s and for Data in the 90s was that sense of there's nobody else like me around. How do I fit in? And they do. Data and Spock are valuable parts of the crew. Odo is a huge part of DS9 and so on.
And I think if you were to consider the fact that both Data and Spock represent characters who have difficulty both controlling their emotions, understanding their emotions, and sometimes understanding the emotions of others, that maybe these were characters who were appealing to folks who were in some way somewhere on the spectrum of let's say autism or just social awkwardness, and a lot of people I think identified with that, and that's why so many folks who have these traits, I believe, are drawn to Star Trek, because Star Trek says to them, you're not that strange, you're misunderstood, but you can but you can be more, and you can also just be yourself and still be wonderful.
I especially like that, the fact, what you were talking about, Dave, about how you had, a Russian guy and you had an Asian guy and you had a black woman all on the bridge of the Enterprise and they're all serving together. And the fact that Sulu is Asian, the fact that Chekhov is Russian, the fact that Uhura has darker skin doesn't matter. It never comes up. The closest it comes up to is Chekhov making stupid jokes about how Russians invented everything, but that's not.
That's just him pulling everybody's chain.
Yeah. And the fact that Sisko was black doesn't matter to his position one way or the other. The fact that Bashir is Arab doesn't matter. They're just other members of the crew, and that doesn't have an impact. And that simple acceptance of it not mattering matters in a weird sort of way.
Right. I think that we're talking about universal appeal, and I think what I've talked about is the foundation, 4 foundations or 4 pillars of Star Trek, which is science, friendship, hope, and exploration. And those things are universal to all humans on some level. And regardless of how you look or socioeconomic status or anything, you can get behind those foundations. And I think Star Trek does that in a unique way, where it says, these are the things that make us human. And these are the things that, we have more in common than we do that separates us. And those are the things that we should all grab onto together as a society.
Now, Trek, through the decades, like anything made by human beings, is imperfect. It's had its imperfections since the very beginning. It's had its faults. But I think one of the things that is redemptive about the series is that over time, it has acknowledged its own faults, its own missteps. It's tried to correct them and do better as it went on. If we look at, for instance, the original series, there's some great episodes, there's some great storytelling, but there are also some cringeworthy moments watching it with a 21st century perspective, looking at something made over 50 years ago. And, some of the sexual politics are really awful. There's some really paternalistic moments. There's just some intrinsic misogyny that was part of the 60s, and just patriarchal thinking that was part of the 60s. Star Trek, I'm happy to say, seems to be evolving and sort of putting that aside and course correcting as it goes along. And I think any good franchise that survives and has this kind of longevity, we'll probably see the same evolution. I think we've seen that in Star Wars, for instance. Star Wars has also, let's say, over the period of decades since 1977, has evolved. It has become more aware of what it's doing, of the audience who's appreciating it. But I'm curious, if we were to say, let's sort of start talking about, let's say, the original series and then the transition to next gen, how did they pull an audience that was so used to TOS? Because there was a lot of resistance from the fan base when they heard about next gen. They're like, what? Well, there's no Kirk, there's no Spock. That's not Star Trek. But I think, Derek, I'd like to throw this to you first, because I think it's your 4 pillars is what won people over with next gen. Would you agree with that?
I would. That's exactly right. I think that there was a lot of animosity towards the new Trek, and I remember I wasn't that great on TNG myself until I started doing research for my first Strange New World story, and I was like, wait a minute, everything that I love about TOS is in TNG. I hadn't really watched a lot of TNG except when I was doing research for that story. I'm like, wait a minute, everything is here. It's all those 4 pillars. And Gene Roddenberry had this idea of not every story, but for a lot of them, having a message in his story. And sometimes it was a really profound message, and sometimes it was just something subtle, or something about friendship. And Next Gen did that. It did that with a really great cast and a really great set of characters. And they always came back to the ideals and pillars of Star Trek. Always, every episode. Even the ones that sometimes missed the mark, they still had that. And what happened, in my opinion, is that people that watched Star Trek TOS, they're like, you know what? It's still Star Trek. It may not be the characters that I've grown up with and grown to love, but the universe is the same. The ideals, the message is the same. And that's what brought everyone on board. And that's what made me love TNG.
And over time, TNG became the juggernaut of Star Trek. It became the most popular incarnation of the franchise to date. It remains so.
Absolutely.
Which is a show that like lots of people were saying was an abomination in 1987, which I
right.
And then come 93, they said the same thing about DS9.
You can't do it if it's not on a ship.
It's not on a ship. What, to boldly go and sit? To boldly sit where no one has sat before?
Hey.
I mean, and I admit, I was one of the naysayers. I was like, really? We're going to sit on space station? Really? And then I see the pilot. And again, as Derek said, it's those 4 pillars. The pilot of DS9 won me over in a way that no other Star Trek pilot ever had or has since.
Right.
I mean, I found the story of Sisko coping with grief, coping with loss, and then dealing with these nonlinear time entities. And it's sort of the idea that grief, in a way, is nonlinear. Grief traps you in the past, and it roots you there so that even as you are moving through time, part of you is lost behind you because you're not allowing it to move forward. And it's all summed up in his line, I exist here.
Right.
Yeah.
You live in a place of pain, and you have to let go of that and allow yourself to move again through time. And it's just a beautiful story. I mean, and the first season of DS9, like the first season of TNG, has its missteps. It has some episodes that don't quite work. But on the whole, from pilot through an episode like Duet, DS9, again, the 4 pillars: hope, humanity, compassion, and then science and exploration, discovering something new, challenging our perceptions, expanding our horizons. And I think DS9, again, it's part of that tradition of, hopeful looking ahead, even though it changed the paradigm to a space station and a frontier and building something in a way, that philosophy of we're going to make our stand. We're here to stay. We're not going to cut and run, and we're going to build something that's going to last. If ever there was a Star Trekian message, that's it. Exploration is great, but commitment and building something is also, I think, a key part of the Star Trek vision.
One of the things that there's 2 aspects of Star Trek that have remained the same, which I think are really important. One is what Kirk said at the beginning of every episode of the original series, which is their main mission statement is basically to find people and talk to them and welcome them and be nice to them.
You go, howdy!
That's what that boils down to, is we're out here to go out and make new friends. Even I mean, the pilot episode of DS9 was that with the wormhole aliens. That was what they were doing. Cisco was seeking out new life and new civilization, and boldly going where no one had gone before. The Voyager even was still doing that, even though their primary mission was to get home. They were still regularly stopping and talking to people and making relationships with people, even if they were only temporary. And the other thing is the fact that a very large percentage of Star Trek episodes start with them responding to a distress call.
Mm-hmm.
That's like one of the go-to starting points of any Star Trek plot, whether it's on TV, in a movie, in a book, in a comic book, even in a role-playing game, is helping someone in distress.
Yeah.
And they're always doing that.
Well, that of course goes back to Star Trek's maritime roots, Horatio
Yes.
Hornblower,
Yeah.
because one of the rules of the sea is you don't ignore distress calls,
Right.
even if they're from an enemy, even
Yep.
if it's from someone you don't know. Ships at sea, there's a special bond between people who go out onto the wine dark sea and are at its mercy. Someone calls for help at sea, you go.
And space is way nastier than the ocean.
Oh yeah.
And something that I think that DS9 did better than TOS or TNG was the staple antagonists, Klingons and Romulans of TOS. They pretty much stayed in that lane. There was times when Kirk would make alliances or friendships, and TNG kind of did that with the Romulans. But DS9 started with people that we already knew that we didn't like, the Cardassians, that were terrible people. And Star Trek said, we don't like these people. These people are really bad people. But you know what? That's life. Sometimes you have to deal with really bad people, and you have to find some kind of commonality, and you have to find a place, a ground to work together. That's just life.
And then
And
eventually they did. And eventually DS9 showed us the Cardassians, who we told you were so awful, are not monolithic. There were people among their society who objected to the occupation, who
Right.
objected to the war, who wanted a different, more spiritual way of life, and they were oppressed. The Cardassians are not all one thing because nobody is all one.
Well, because nobody is, and there it is. And you never know that
Well,
until you start talking to those people and keeping them. If you keep them always at arm's length and you keep that stereotype, you'll never engage and you'll never have those connections that DS9 showed us that you can have.
But the writers clearly were thinking in that direction from the beginning on DS9, because they laid the groundwork for that with the episode Duet,
Yes.
where you had the guy who was just the clerk,
Right.
Eamon Maritza, and then he goes to the trouble of having himself, I'm sorry, spoilers here, having himself altered to look like this Gul Darheel, who he served under and who was a massive war criminal, who he knows died without ever facing justice. He's so guilt-ridden, this poor clerk, that he's willing to step in as a proxy for this criminal
Right.
and accept punishment because he feels like somebody has to atone for this crime. And if the guy who did it can't, I should, because I was there and I did nothing.
Right.
And it's a beautiful story. And it basically, it's that first clue that, the Cardassians are not monolithic.
Right.
They have consciences, and some of them feel guilt. There are decent people among them. You have to find them.
And you never do that if you don't start that conversation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So let's move ahead into Voyager, where suddenly the paradigm changed again to boldly be lost, where no one has been lost before. But they were lost by choice. They could have made it home, but they made an ethical choice to say, our fortune is not more important than these people's safety.
Yes.
They made a choice to do the right thing, even though they knew it would cost them. Very Trek.
Yes.
Very.
Yeah.
Very.
Now you're in the midst of a Voyager rewatch right now, right, Keith?
Yes. Yes.
So,
Sure.
as you've watched the show in sort of steady installments, week by week, and you're watching this evolution, how are you feeling about Voyager now, as opposed to when it was first broadcast? Are you perceiving it differently in the light of, say, the series that have come after it?
Yes. For a couple of reasons. I didn't much like Voyager when it first aired. I gave up on it, watching it regularly, and afterward really only watched episodes I needed to watch for works of fiction I was writing. And I liked some episodes, but I was frustrated by it, by what I thought were a lot of missed opportunities. I still see some of those, but part of the problem was I was watching it at the same time I was watching Deep Space Nine, and on DS9, actions had consequences. DS9, it wasn't as heavily serialized as what you see on television now, but it was things progressed on DS9. The status quo changed, and those changes remained. Something happens in one episode, it affects every episode after that. And part of that is just a part and parcel of being in the same place all the time, so that you have to live with the consequences because you haven't gone anywhere. But watching it now, 25 years later, without of necessity comparing it to Deep Space Nine every week and just letting it stand on its own, and knowing going in that consequences just isn't a thing they're going to do, I'm enjoying it a lot more. The show, because I know what I'm getting.
Because you don't have the false expectation.
Exactly. It's still got its flaws, but knowing that the producers were not willing to do major episode to episode continuity, knowing that they were not willing to have anything have an effect beyond the 42 minutes in which it was being told, when they colored within those lines, they did some great stuff. There were some really strong episodes there.
I think what confused me about Voyager at the time is I was looking for that sort of serialized narrative continuity that we were seeing on DS9.
Right.
And that's not what they were doing. They were deliberately choosing to go in a more episodic fashion. They were looking more for out of the box thinking in terms of really sort of cutting edge science fiction ideas, or even just something weird. Like they just wanted to find the coolest idea. And even if it didn't always add up to, let's say, the most compelling character story, they wanted to explore interesting, different, strange, see something you've never seen before. And that, I realized belatedly, that was the editorial philosophy, and I just didn't comprehend it at the
they
time.
still have that Star Trek philosophy in there. I just did an episode, Counterpoint, where they have to go through this totalitarian regime in order to continue their journey home. And rather than go around it, they go through it because this is a state that rounds up telepaths and presumably kills them. They don't specify, but they go after telepaths at the very least, and do not think telepaths are horrible people and must be stopped. And we find out early on in the episode that Voyager is smuggling telepaths to safety. They're being an underground railroad for a bunch of telepaths.
Oh, that's very cool. I never saw that one.
And that I love that. That is so very, very Star Trek. They are helping people who are oppressed against a totalitarian regime. They know they're not going to be able to do it permanently, but at least since they're in the area, they should try to help people.
All right. Before we move on from Voyager, Derek, are there any thoughts you have about Voyager that you'd like to share before I move us ahead to the next incarnation of Trek?
Well, everything Keith said, he's the one doing the rewatch, so he has a pulse. But I was thinking about the 7th season episode Void, where they're trapped in this void, and even the members of the bridge crew, Tuvok, even Chakotay, are saying, we're stuck here. Maybe we need to adopt a more selfish posture and just, not help anyone, not look to create any kind of coalition. And Janeway's like, no, that's not Starfleet. That's not who we are. We help people. And we're low on rations. Yes, this area of space is absorbing energy. But you know what? We're going to give our food. We're going to replicate and give tools, because that's the only way to survive, is when you reach out to other people and connect. And when they started doing that, some people were like, what are you doing? But then others said, you know what? Because you did that, I will now come to your rescue and your aid when you need it. And that's Star Trek. That's what you need. Is that hope, is that friendship, it's that science, and it's that exploration. And it folds in and of itself, but it does it so differently with each series that sometimes I think we don't realize what we're getting, but we know it's Star Trek.
Yeah.
I do want to say one other thing that's important about Voyager, which is Janeway.
Yes.
I know one of the reasons why I decided to do, I wasn't originally going to do a Voyager rewatch. One of the reasons why I decided to is because a lot of people I know who are now grown women who grew up watching Voyager, and for whom Janeway was an incredibly important role model.
Yes.
And that's not a small thing. It means as much to women as the presence of Sulu meant to Asian people in 66, as the presence of Uhura meant to African Americans in 66. And Cisco in 93 for that matter. And having a woman be in charge of a Star, especially coming, after Turnabout Intruder and Your World of Starship Captains doesn't allow
Exactly.
women more of that
I've always,
paternalistic nonsense you were talking
I've
about.
always thought though that she should, what's her name, Janice Lester,
Yeah.
unreliable narrator.
Granted, but she still said it and nobody contradicted
If
her.
there ever was one, right? Yeah.
Maybe nobody contradicted her because they were all like,
She's nuts.
she's batshit crazy.
Let's.
And nobody thought it needed to be said. It should be obvious. She's crazy.
Which is how you can rationalize it now, but
Yeah.
Right. But,
Well, let's be honest. At the time, the Star Trek writers were shitheads.
yeah.
Yeah.
So it's good to see Janeway pushing against that
Yeah.
all the time.
Yeah, and you're right. That is an important
step.
step. Now, do you think it was a regressive step? And was it any coincidence that around the time America voted in George W. Bush in 2000, and we suddenly find ourselves, under going in a very different direction as a country, that we now move to Star Trek Enterprise with a lot of white guys topping the bill. What do we think about Enterprise and what it said about where Star Trek's head was at with regard to the culture? I mean, aside from being a prequel, which I know a lot of people gave it crap for, just on its own merits, its casting, the kind of stories it told, the way it told them, its sensibilities about the future that it was depicting. Do we feel that it was a reflection in some way that on the era that it was made? I mean, did the era it was made suddenly have this feedback effect that pushed Star Trek into a new direction?
That's interesting because I think that in a lot of ways, Enterprise, the crew was closest to who we are today.
Right.
We make mistakes. There were no star dates. There were just regular dates and those kind of things. And it was like, well, wear a cap and all those kind of things. And I enjoyed that. And I know that a lot of people that I know that watched Enterprise enjoyed that. It was as close as it showed that we can get there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that being said, the minorities on that show really didn't have a lot to do, usually ever. And they had incredible acting chops, as we saw in certain episodes. So I would have liked to have seen that more, because to get to TOS, to get to DS9, you have to show how Enterprise was the forefather for all that and allow those characters their stories to push forward.
All right. But I guess what I'm sort of looking at is, for instance, if you look behind the scenes on Enterprise, I believe one of the producers who was brought in on maybe later, like season 3, season 4, Manny Koto, who later came to much more prominence in the television realm as a producer on 24, a show which I love, and I've written a tie-in based on it. But even I acknowledge that's a very right-wing sensibility show. It's it's very much skewed toward patriarchy, white guy solving everything by beating the crap out of people and yelling at them. It's a very, I'm sorry to say, it's a very white show. Do we feel like that shift in who was running the show had any kind of effect on the philosophy that it embodied?
Might have. I think the problem wasn't so much that it was too capital C conservative, but just too lowercase c conservative.
Too careful.
They weren't. This was an opportunity to tell different kinds of stories, and I don't think they really did that enough. At least not until the 4th season. Honestly, I think the 4th season of Enterprise is what the first season of Enterprise should have been.
Yeah.
Setting the stage for what we know is going to come next.
Right.
And that was the 4th season was when they embraced like 3-part stories and 2-part stories, and really digging into a lot of the different things. The problem was, of course, that everybody had stopped watching by then, which is why it was canceled. But
now, sadly, since we don't have a 2-hour panel, I would love to spend some time on the movies and then the 20-year franchise of books, followed by Discovery and Picard. But we're kind of running out of time. So before we before we open the floor to questions, thoughts from each of you on where Star Trek was, say, around 2000, with Enterprise and the movies having wrapped up with Nemesis around 2002, 2003.
Yeah,
2002. And where we are today in 2021 with Discovery, Picard, the new animated series that are coming down the pike, Strange New Worlds coming down the pike.
Literally down the pike.
Yeah, sorry. Bad. I didn't even realize what I'd done. I'm very sorry. Uh, what do you think about the journey Trek has taken over the last 20 years?
I think you mentioned about how there was an issue with there being a prequel. I think that set Star Trek on a road that it finally got back off of this past year.
With
Um,
Picard,
with Picard and also with Discovery jumping to the 32nd century, and with Lower Decks for that matter.
Mhm.
All three of those shows finally, for the first time since Nemesis, moved Star Trek forward in the timeline. I think there was way too much looking back between Enterprise,
too much
early
nostalgia.
Discovery, and the Bad Robot movies.
Yeah, way too
It's
much
basic.
nostalgia.
Star Trek is better when it moves forward.
I
Part of
agree.
the appeal of Next Generation was that they were jumping forward 80 years and moving the Federation forward and moving the characters forward. And I think that's really the way Star Trek should be going. There have been some good stories told in these prequels.
Oh yes.
And despite all that, I'm really looking forward to Strange New Worlds, not because it's a prequel, but because Anson Mount, Ethan Peck, and Rebecca Romijn are awesome, and I want to see more of them.
And they have fantastic chemistry.
Yeah, yeah.
I don't know if it was you who told me or someone else, but a shore leave a couple of years ago, both Ethan Peck and Anson Mount were guests at the con. And at one point on like a Saturday, early Saturday evening, around the time people are going out to dinner, those two guys come walking down the corridor together, just sort of gabbing between themselves, having a private moment as friends. But as they're walking together, the vibe, the fact that they were walking in cadence with each other at exactly, it was Pike and Spock incarnate. They were in character, they were in vibe, even when they're off screen.
Yeah.
They are these guys. Yeah. They're amazing. They are these guys.
Yeah, they are.
And I think that's going to make for an amazing show. I can hardly wait for Strange New Worlds.
Yeah.
It's going to be great. Derek, your sort of parting thoughts on the topic before we open to questions.
Yeah, I think that over the last 20 odd years, we've seen a lot of changes in Star Trek, with the J.J. Abrams films, and now with Discovery. One of the things that has impressed me, to be quite honest, is the addition in the writing rooms of other voices, because you need, I think, other voices to tell the future, because you can't, I mean, you can, but the future should be told by everyone.
More diverse viewpoints.
More diverse, right? People.
I mean, folks like Bowie Kim, Erica Lippold, more women in the room. People like our friend Kirsten Beyer.
Right.
Now Michelle Paradise running Discovery.
Yeah. And what you do with that is you start to tell stories that a lot of us haven't considered, and a lot of us certainly haven't seen before in Star Trek. And if Star Trek is to thrive and push forward, that's what it needs. It needs those voices in those writers' rooms to say, hey, this is my life experience. Let me take that life experience and put it into Star Trek, something that I love, and give it to society.
I agree with that. And I will just add before we go to questions that I think the same philosophy needs to be applied to the Star Trek novels. As much as I think we've done wonderful work over the last 20 years, the one area where we have failed spectacularly was to bring in new voices of different perspectives. We have a dearth of female authors. We have almost no authors of color at this point. And I think that that's a major failing. And I'm hoping that as the franchise moves forward in the years to come, that there will be more opportunities for women and people of color and people of different gender identities to become part of the writing community for Star Trek books, and to help us broaden our perspective and tell stories that maybe we wouldn't have thought of. And I think that's something that needs to happen.
Absolutely. I know Star Trek Adventures, by being on that, I've been able to tell stories Star Trek stories that have been inside of me. And I'm like, well, now I can tell them. And I think that's one of the beautiful things, is that Star Trek belongs to all of us and we all love it. So let's all tell those stories.
So I'd like to open the floor of questions, and we may need a little help from our tech guy here if we can't figure this out on our own. We seem to have a couple of Q&As here. Let me see if I can open them up. Okay, the first question I see here is from Lorraine Anderson, and she asked the panel, do you think there will eventually be too much Trek? What do you guys think? Do you think there's a point where we could oversaturate and, it could work against us?
I know I personally have a fear of that. I don't I love it so much that I want to see all of it, but at the same time, I don't want to oversaturate Star Trek and then oversaturate it and then causing a drought when people become disinterested in Star Trek and not want to see it on television or on film. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know. I love where we are. I love what's coming, and maybe just cap it at the new shows coming, and then let's do that for the next, say, 5-10 years.
Okay.
I don't no. I think the market basically I think there will be market corrections if that happens.
Okay.
There will be too much Trek when there's a lot of it and people stop watching it.
I think the only problem is when you have too much Trek that's not good.
Yes, that's the thing. We had from when DS9 debuted until basically during the run of DS9. So from 93 until 99, you had 2 Star Trek series on the air and a movie every 2 years.
Right.
And at least 1 or 2 new novels every month and a monthly comic book, several monthly comic books. I mean, at that point, I think that was when Marvel had the license. And they were putting out, 4 different comic series. And nobody was complaining about too much Trek at that time because everybody was enjoying it. I didn't start hearing complaints about too much Star Trek until around 2001, 2002, because Voyager wasn't as popular. Enterprise was the first Star Trek spinoff and so far the only Star Trek spinoff to fail in the marketplace.
Yeah. And even then it lasted 4 seasons, which is a lot longer than some mainstream.
Which is 3.5 seasons more than most TV shows that are produced.
And a season longer than the original series, which launched the whole thing. So let's not be too hard on Enterprise.
Right. But
I'm no big fan of Enterprise, but I think you got to give it its due.
Yes, but no, there will be too much Star Trek, like I said, when people lose interest. But it's right now there's still interest, and they're telling variety of great. I love what CBS All Access is doing philosophy-wise. I love that they're basically taking the approach that it's one big Star Trek universe. Let's pick bits and pieces of it and tell fun stories in different eras and different formats and different everything. We haven't mentioned short treks, which is one of my favorite things.
Oh yeah, the short film series, which is great.
Yeah,
I'd like to get through a couple more questions. I've got 2 in a row here from Michael Winters, and I think I can answer both of these quickly and move us down the list. His first question is, do you think that we need more episodic series that allow us to go back to the old open submission policy of TNG and DS9? I'm going to tell you, as a TV writer, as someone who has been in contact with the people who work in those rooms and make those shows, those days are gone. That is just not how TV shows are made today. It's not how they're sold today. It's not how they're distributed today. There is just a sense that these things happen. They are written in the room. Open submission policy of TNG, DS9 was a quirk, an anomaly. It was a rare thing that they were willing to do it at all. Most shows don't. Most shows, to get a pitch session, you have to be established. You have to have an agent. You got to call and make appointments. You got to beg and plead to get in the door. So no, I don't think that's ever coming back. His second question is, do we think the lack of representation of diverse authors is due to the reduction in the number of novels published each year? This is when he was reading, there were 2 a month, down to 1, now not even 1 a month. I don't think that we can blame the lack of diverse representation on the reduction in the number of publishing slots, just because this is a problem that predates it. Yes, there were a few more women authors working in the line back in, say, the late 90s through the early aughts. Folks like Heather Jarman, Diane Duane, Diane Carey, et cetera, et cetera. Kirsten Beyer, of course, being very notable in that respect. And we've got some new female authors coming up the ladder now with some new books that are coming out. But we're still way too white, and we're still way too straight. And that's a problem that goes back many years, and it's got to be aggressively tackled. And I don't think we can blame that on cuts in the publishing line. I think that's just a problem of editorial philosophy. So now we've got a couple of really fun questions here, but we'll start with this one from Sarah and Alex Rosenzweig, friends of the panel. What is our hope for Trek's future? What do we want to see? Let's start with you, Keith. What do you hope for in Trek's future? What would you like to see?
I would like to see more of what I just said a few minutes ago, honestly, is the approach of, this is a big universe, let's tell stories in all of it. And I think the model that Secret Hideout is using with the channel about to be changed from CBS All Access to Paramount Plus, is that they're telling stories in different areas with different focuses.
Mhm.
I like the fact that, for example, Picard is on the one hand counting on TNG nostalgia, but also showing us elements of the Star Trek universe that we've never really seen before. Much more of civilian life and life outside Starfleet in addition to life in it.
I love some of
Um,
its revelations about Romulan society.
Also, oh yeah, that series done more than any of the shows with the Romulans. And there's an opportunity here to do a Vulcan series. There's an opportunity to do a Klingon series, a Romulan series, a Cardassian series,
a Klingon series would be hard because of the makeup. The makeup is extensive and time consuming.
Yes,
and a whole cast doing that every day, every week.
Yeah,
that would be a budget.
Which would also be a problem with the Kelpian series. But you can do it if you do it like a mini series, just something that's only like 6 episodes. You don't have to do a whole series on it, but you can do shorter bits. And the flexibility of the format works in its favor. So I want to see more of that.
Although I will point out although a lot of people talk about wanting an anthology series, or they talk about, well, you could just do a one-off or a mini series. One of the realities of television production is that there are a lot of startup costs in terms of things like set building, set construction, developing original prosthetics that will fit the right actors. These are all sunk costs, fixed costs, and usually the way they are justified is that these costs are amortized across multiple seasons of production. And therefore the cost is spread out and it doesn't all have to come due at once. When you do it for a small dedicated thing, like let's say a special 10 episode or 6 episode mini, all that cost gets sunk into 6 episodes, and then you have no chance to amortize the cost unless you can find a way to repurpose all of that into some other ongoing series. Right. So that's the reason you're not going to see a lot of Star Trek anthology series. It's the reason you're not going to see a lot of one-offs or miniseries. It's because the money it takes to get those things up and running can't be recouped over time. Mm-hmm. So that is one of the production realities that a lot of people don't really know about.
Yeah. Some of it can be, though, especially in Star Trek where a lot of the same sets are used. I mean, hey, the sets they built for Star Trek the Motion Picture continue to be used not only in all the other movies, but on Next Gen and on Voyager. They were using, like, the engineering set is basically the same engineering set they built in 1979.
It's the same reason. Anyway, before I blather on, Derek, I'm sorry I cut you off. What do you want to see in the future of Trek?
I want to see things. I want to see more exploration. I want to see different types of storytelling. I want to see us meeting the other that we have no relationship with, that we really can't relate to in any way, and then yet we have to. And I think that's what actual science and exploration in actual life, at some point, we're going to meet a species out there that we can't even relate to, but we're going to have to. And Star Trek has touched on that at times, but it's usually humanoid species, because of course, and because of these things. So I would like to see a series that just goes so far out there that maybe into the next galaxy, and just says, this is something totally abstract from what we've ever seen in Star Trek, but we have to still relate to these, because they're still people.
And you know what I think would be a great avenue for that would be yet another animated series, but one with a different sensibility.
Yes.
Like there was a Netflix series that was just released a few months ago called The Liberator. Yes. And it's a new form of rotoscope, or it looks like rotoscope, but it's a new form of digital animation that sort of is a hybrid live action animation thing. I would love to see something in that visual style for Star Trek that then opens up the possibilities of non-humanoid aliens and more bizarre environments.
Right.
And, push the envelope in terms of narrative, in terms of science fiction thinking, but also save some money by changing the format.
And
the other thing I'd like to see would be my novel series Vanguard getting turned into a series, which could share sets with Strange New Worlds.
There you go.
Yeah, but that's just my selfish desires.
And I like that they're doing more animated series and in different style, because Prodigy and Lower Decks are 2 completely different animation styles.
And they're going to look very different. Yeah.
And the 2 shorts that they did also were radically different.
I think people are going to be very impressed when they see Prodigy. Prodigy is coming to Nickelodeon later this year. Yes. It's going to be visually gorgeous. I've seen the lookbook. I've seen sort of the art principles that are behind it. The storytelling is right on. It's got heart, it's got brains, it's got humor. It's just going to be great. I think that, I've said this before, 50 years from now, when our generation is gone from this earth, there are going to be 50-year-old Star Trek fans, and people are going to say, "What got you into Trek?" And they're going to say, "Star Trek Prodigy."
Wow, that's all you ask for.
Prodigy
Yeah.
is what Prodigy. I think when we ask why does Star Trek thrive, I think 50 years from now the answer is going to be Prodigy. Prodigy is why this franchise is going to outlive all of us.
Yeah. And I will just say quickly, I've noticed a lot of people that don't even know about Star Trek are playing Star Trek Adventures.
Really?
And yeah, and that's what's
Interesting.
crazy about it is like I'll sit on the forums and I'll just like watch, and they're like, "Oh yeah, I don't know about Trek, but now I'm playing Star Trek because maybe a friend or two invited them, and then they read the Star Trek Adventures books, and then they come back around and start watching the series. So it all folds into itself. Star Trek is thriving in all these different mediums, and it's because of these staples that are bringing people together.
All right, let's see. I'm looking at the question list. Not much here I think we could actually answer. Star Trek books used to be predominantly written by women. I think it was maybe more 50-50. Dan, Dwayne, Allegraph. What happened to change that? They stopped writing and other people started. And that's really about all I can figure on that. Whole series, that's not even really a question. Is Prodigy with Janeway pre or post Voyager? I can't tell you that. I'm under an NDA. So that's all I can really say about that. That takes us.
Somebody in the chat had a question about what Star Trek Adventures is, and the short version is it's a Star Trek role playing game, basically.
There you go.
Tabletop role playing.
I'm sorry.
It was in the chat. It passed by in the chat real fast.
It's
Gotcha.
a role playing game.
Anyway, we're at 1:52, so we've got 3 minutes left, 1 minute each. Keith, where can people find you online, and what do you have coming out next?
I've still got the Star Trek Voyager rewatch twice a week, every Monday and Thursday. Once
Tor.com.
new episodes on Tor.com as well, and when new episodes of Star Trek air next, I'll be reviewing them. I've got a new thriller out that I wrote with Dr. Manish K. Batra called Animal, which is currently on sale. There was a nice big advertisement in Times Square, which was cool. You can find me online at decandido.net, which links to all my social media: Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Tor.com, my YouTube channel. I have a Patreon where you can give me money and I give you content. And I've got a lot of stuff coming out. Check me out online and you can find it there.
Derek, where can people find you online, and do you have anything coming out that we should know about?
Yeah, I have a Sherlock Holmes story coming out in the Tying the Tide.
Turning the Tide.
Turning the Tide, excuse me, in an anthology that's coming out next month, actually.
Yes.
And I've got some really cool things coming out with Star Trek Adventures, new species that I created, some really cool stuff that's coming out with that. And to reach me or to contact me or to ask me any kind of questions, I'm happy to do it. Contact me on Twitter. Attico is my handle on Twitter, and I'll tell you about Star Trek Adventures or any other question you want to ask me.
Derek's story in Turning the Tide is fantastic, by the way.
Great. And I, your moderator, not so humble, David Mack. You can find me on the web at davidmack.pro. That's David Mack, MACK.PRO. My website links to my Twitter. It links to my Facebook author page, yada, yada, yada. My two most recently published books from last August are The Shadow Commission, the third and for now final book in my Dark Arts trilogy from Tor Books, and my most recent Star Trek novel, More Beautiful Than Death, which is set in the J.J. Abrams Kelvinverse of movies. And as some of you may have seen, because it's going around Twitter and websites like wildfire today, I am working on a trilogy with Dayton Ward and James Swallow. The trilogy is called Star Trek Coda. My book is called Oblivion's Gate. It'll be book 3. Book 1 is Moments Asunder by Dayton Ward. Book 2 is The Ashes of Tomorrow by James Swallow. And that's going to be out at the end of this year. And that's going to be probably a big wrap up for the 20-year-long shared literary continuity. That's our panel. We have to sign off in a few seconds. Thank you so much, audience, for being here. Thank you, panelists, Derek and Keith, for joining us. It's been lots of fun, and we look forward to talking Trek with all of you again sometime very soon. Thank you, Farpoint.
Yes.
Thank you, Farpoint.
Yes. And check out the dealer's room on the Discord channel and buy things. They need stuff.
Yes, please do.
155. Kabang.